As anyone who has read the newspapers recently knows, privatization indeed is a very controversial issue. People involved on both sides of this debate and who oppose passionately. However, in this program, we do not intend both sides. Our intention is to examine the entire gamut of issues involved in the privatization movement. For example, we will look at privatization. Then we go on to see the results of privatization, and then examine the reasons for the gap between the rhetoric and reality of privatization. We will also look at how does one design appropriate privatization strategies to close this gap between rhetoric and reality. And obviously we will look at the choice of privatization methods and choice of appropriate institutional arrangements to implement a privatization strategy. And of course, finally, we will also look at the international experience with privatization. Let us start from the beginning and ask ourselves, why privatization? Essentially, there are no bad reasons for privatization. To start with, most countries have gone for privatization primarily because of the revenue motive. There are three traditional sources of money: the aid, the taxation, and the borrowing. And all these three sources have increasingly dried up. As far as the taxation is concerned, most countries have already taxed the citizens to the hilt, and there's not much scope left. And borrowing is obviously becoming very, very difficult, because both from the demand side and supply side, the demand for money is increasing and the supply for money is decreasing. In addition, one would argue, since the private sector is more efficient than the public sector, privatization will lead to gains in efficiency. In addition, privatization, according to some people, would allow the government to focus its attention on the essential functions of the government. They argue that it is not the business of the government to be in business, and the sooner it gets out, the better for it. The first reason for privatization, by what we're saying, is to prevent the day-to-day interference in the functioning of the public enterprises. Some argue that the only way to eject the backseat drivers is to privatize. The fifth and the sixth reasons for privatization are that if you privatize, then it allows you to have access to important markets and technologies, and especially if you sell the public enterprises to multinational corporations. In addition, often, if the stated objectives of the public enterprises have been achieved, then people argue it is better to privatize. Often governments discover that the original intentions for which the public enterprises were set up have been found to be infeasible. That is, they discover that it is not possible to achieve those objectives through the medium of public enterprise. In that case, it has been suggested that it is better to privatize. The eighth reason for privatization is that when we discover that some of the original objectives are no longer essential, and the government has changed its priorities, it is better to privatize. And finally, the ninth reason is rather straightforward. It is the ideological preference. Here, like people have preference for the public sector, some people have simple preference for the private sector. Since these reasons for privatization appear to be so logical and convincing, one wonders what has been the impact of privatization. That is, what has been the result of privatization effort around the world. I think it is fair to say that except for a handful of countries, there has been a striking gap between rhetoric and reality of privatization. Except for a few countries in the Eastern Europe and in Latin America, for instance, like Chile and Mexico, there has been a gap between the rhetoric and reality of privatization. It is also fair to say that this gap between rhetoric and reality has been more for the less developed countries than for the more developed countries. Having said this, one cannot deny the reality of privatization. It's a growing and living phenomenon from the capitalist world to the communist world. If that is the case, one has to ask, why is there a gap between the rhetoric and reality? Well, one answer for that is that for every reason for privatization, there appears to be an equally convincing reason against it. At least there is a different point of view. To explore the other side of the picture, we asked an eminent thinker, a person who has been involved with public enterprise reforms for a very, very long time, Mr. Ramasamy Iyer, who is currently professor at the Center for Policy Research and has been a member of the Heritage High Commission, which wrote a very comprehensive report on public sector reforms in India.
Well, so far as the living is concerned, we must realize that what is involved is a sale of capital assets. In other words, we are getting a long-term capital inflow and foregoing possible still future benefits. This really needs a careful economic appraisal, which is not always done. It is therefore not clear that we are gaining by the sale, by the privatization of public enterprises. The second argument is about gains in efficiency. This again can be subdivided into two things. One is privatization is a solution to the problem of public sector inefficiency. But by privatizing public enterprises, we are changing the quality of public enterprises. They cease to be public. Therefore, we are not really solving the problem of public sector efficiency. What we are really doing is to argue that public enterprises cannot be efficient, and in order to make them efficient, they must be made private. What this implies is that the private sector is necessarily more efficient than the public sector. But this does not really follow. Efficiency and inefficiency occur both in the private sector and in the public sector. To mention an example, for years, we have argued that Tisco is efficient and SAIL is inefficient. But in fact, last year, SAIL has performed much better than Tisco. Moreover, it has been tremendous incidence of simplifying the private sector and legislation on securities. Therefore, it is wrong to draw a line between public and private enterprises and assume that this line coincides with the line between efficiency and inefficiency. We can make public enterprises efficient, and that is what we want, without necessarily privatizing them. So the answer to efficiency doesn't lie in privatization. The third point is that it is not really the business of the state to engage in industry or commerce, and that it should get rid of public enterprises in order to focus on the specific functions, which may be law and order, public health, education, social services, and so on. But then this assumes that there are certain functions which are necessarily the functions of the state, and that there are certain other functions which are not the functions of the state. Now, these are not axioms, these are matters of opinion, these are matters of current philosophy. When we begin to develop individual separate ideas in the member state should be. Now, these ideas will change over time, but we cannot assume that for all time there are certain long-term functions of the state and certain functions which are not the functions of the state. So this argument does not really have much merit. There is nothing wrong. The state should not engage in industry or commerce if that's what it wants to do, unless we have an ideological presupposition that the state should not do this. And of course, there can be no argument with such an ideological position.
As you can see, these arguments appear to be very convincing. In addition to these arguments, for every other argument for privatization, there is an equally convincing counter-argument. For example, some people would argue that the real source of efficiency is competition and not necessarily change in ownership per se. However, I think the point is sufficiently clear. And this indeed is the crux of the problem. When public policymakers are faced with two experts arguing passionately on either side of the debate, they seem to be hesitant in moving forward and going with the necessarily required speed for implementing privatization programs. In addition, they are also not sure whether this is the right thing to do. And that really is the true explanation why there seems to exist a gap between rhetoric and reality. The next issue, therefore, is how does one believe close this gap between rhetoric and reality. If you ask me, there are 4 things that I'm required to do to close this gap. These are, we need to design an appropriate privatization strategy, we need to choose appropriate privatization methods, we need to create an appropriate institutional arrangement to implement such a strategy, and finally we need to promote appropriate environment which would be conducive for privatization. In this program, we do not have the time to discuss all these at great length. Therefore, we will focus on how does one design an appropriate privatization strategy, and we will examine the experience of India in this regard. Let's start with this. Different countries have different motivations for going in for privatization. In the case of India, the basic reason has been the increasing losses of India's public enterprises. People for a long time have been concerned with the increasing deficit of India's public sector. With this, most reasonable people would agree. The disagreement starts, however, when people suggest the same remedy for the losses of the public sector. This is like suggesting that anybody who has fever, you put the person on the operating table and do a triple bypass heart surgery. Now, fever could be for different reasons. It could be because of pneumonia, it could be because of heart problem, it could be because of some other problem with the body. Therefore, what we need to look at is the reason for the fever, and then prescribe an appropriate medicine. Similarly, the losses of India's public sector are due to various reasons. There are losses and losses and losses. What we need to do is examine the causes of these losses and then suggest appropriate remedies for eliminating these losses. The 250 or so that belong to the central government sector were classified by the Department of Public Enterprises around 4 dimensions. The first dimension was the degree of competition. Here, public enterprises were divided depending on whether they were in the negative sector or in the monopoly sector. For example, ITBC, the India Tourism Development Corporation, is in a very competitive sector. It is naturally very different from the Nuclear Power Corporation of India, which is in a highly monopolized sector. Indeed, there is only one such company in the country. The second dimension was the degree of legitimacy. This is a strong word, but what it means is that some losses of certain public enterprises are due to legitimate public purpose. For example, many losses of the Food Corporation of India could be considered due to legitimate reasons. After all, the Food Corporation of India is not allowed to charge very high price from the consumers, and it is indeed required to pay a substantial, handsome price to the farmers, so it is not seen as exploiting the farmers. Now, with this kind of pricing policy is bound to make a loss. So therefore, some of the losses of the Food Corporation of India are certainly for legitimate public purpose. But on the other hand, a large part of the losses of the Food Corporation of India may not be due to a public purpose. They may be due to sheer inefficiency on the part of the management. Those losses may be termed as illegitimate. The third dimension consists of the degree of transparency. Here, a distinction is sought to be made between the explicit losses and the implicit losses of the public sector. Now, explicit losses is easy to understand. They are the losses reported in the balance sheet of a company. However, the implicit loss is rather interesting. It is the difference between the potential profit and the actual profit. For example, if a company is making 1,600 crores and is capable of making 1,900 crores, then the implicit loss is 300 crores. The fourth dimension consists of the degree of turnaround potential. Here, public enterprises are categorized depending on whether it is possible or not possible to turn them around. But when you put these together, the four dimensions, that is, you get the so-called privatization matrix. Each set of these matrix represents a group of public enterprises which have four attributes. For example, the public enterprises falling in cell number 1 consists of those public enterprises which are making explicit losses, while in the competitive sector, the losses are illegitimate and it is possible to turn them around. Similarly, we have 16 such cases. Naturally, these are 16 different cases and they require different strategies to solve the problems of these 16 different cases. And that has been the approach of the government of India. The broad point is, given this entire range of public enterprises, we need to have a multi-dimensional policy to solve the problems of the public sector. The policy that was evolved consists of 7 dimensions. The first element of this multi-dimensional policy consists of restructuring the portfolio of investment. What we mean here is that the line dividing the boundary between public and private sector is being changed. More and more areas of the world for the public sector are being opened from the private sector. In fact, from 17 reserved areas they have been brought down to 8. Areas such as mining, power, telecom have been opened to the private sector. The second element of this policy consists of restructuring the equity pattern in the public enterprises. This is the policy of disinvestment. The third element of this multi-dimensional policy consists of the restructuring the quality of interface between the government and the public enterprises. This, of course, is the policy of memorandum of understanding. Then we have restructuring the public enterprise rules, where greater professionalism is being sought. The role of government money is being reduced, and the role of professionals is being increased in the public enterprise rules. The fourth element of this policy consists of restructuring the public enterprises. Here, as you know, the Sikh Industries Company Act has been amended. The so-called SIPA has been amended, and public enterprises now can be referred to BIFR. Then attempts are being made to restructure the net, the safety net for the workers. And finally, the entire benefit policy environment, from customs duty to taxation to all areas of public policy, are being restructured to provide a level playing field between the public and the private sector. Indeed, our focus should not be focused on the means, but rather on the ultimate objective. As we saw in this program, that for every argument for a particular option, one can always think of a counter-argument. And in fact, one can keep on debating ad infinitum. The idea is to take a technocratic, pragmatic approach and get things done. I believe those nations which will keep their eyes focused on the ultimate goal are likely to succeed in this process.